What if the person you loved most, the one you gave everything for, turned on you in the most hurtful way imaginable? Imagine raising your child with everything you have, your time, your energy, your heart, and then, one day, hearing those words that would forever change your life. You're a burden to me. That was the moment I realized the truth. The truth that all those years of sacrifice, all the sleepless nights, the years of struggle, and the endless work I put in to give my son, Dylan, a better life, it didn't matter. None of it mattered to him. And when I heard him say that I was the weight holding him down, I knew I had to make a decision. Was I going to keep living my life based on his approval? Or was it time for me to finally live for myself? It took every ounce of courage to walk away. But in that moment, I knew I had no choice. I couldn't stay in a place where I wasn't valued, where love was conditional and respect was non-existent. What happened next? It wasn't just a story of heartbreak, but one of rebirth. As I started a new chapter of my life, something incredible happened. Dylan's world, everything he thought he knew about success, began to crumble. And when he reached out to me, it was too late. The truth was already revealed, not just to me, but to him too. The question is, could he learn the most important lesson of all? Could he learn that respect, love, and independence are earned, not given? This is the story of how I proved my worth, not through words, but through actions that left my son speechless. Edward's life had never been easy, but it had always been steady. He was the kind of man who lived for his family, who woke up at the crack of dawn and worked tirelessly to ensure that his loved ones never went without. His hands were rough, calloused from years of physical labor, and his back ached from the constant strain of building a life from the ground up. But through it all, he found pride in the work he did, knowing it was all for the future of his family. Growing up in a modest home, Edward had learned early that life wasn't about wealth or material possessions. It was about love, sacrifice, and doing whatever it took to provide for the people you cared about. His own father had worked in a factory, toiling away for long hours, never complaining, never asking for much. Edward had taken that example to heart and carried it with him as he built his own life. He married young, and together with his wife, they raised a son, Dylan, who was everything they had hoped for, a bright, energetic boy with big dreams. They weren't rich, far from it, but they were happy. Edward and his wife did what they could to ensure Dylan had opportunities they never had, sending him to good schools and making sacrifices so that he could pursue his passions. They worked hard so that Dylan could have the kind of life they dreamed of for him. Edward often thought to himself that if he could just give Dylan the opportunities he never had, then everything would be worth it. As Dylan grew older, however, things started to change. Edward watched, helpless at times, as his son began to drift away from the values he had worked so hard to instill in him. It started with small things, comments about how they couldn't afford certain luxuries, how their home was too small, how life was harder than it should have been. Edward chalked it up to the frustrations of growing up, but over time, those small comments grew into something more significant. Dylan had developed a sense of entitlement that was foreign to Edward. He began to resent the life his parents had given him, believing that he deserved more. Dylan would often talk about moving away, about leaving the small town they lived in and heading to bigger cities where he could make it big. Edward didn't understand at first. He had built everything they had with hard work and determination, and yet Dylan seemed to think that wasn't enough. And in that small, quiet moment, Edward realized that love wasn't about controlling the outcomes or being right. It was about understanding, patience, and learning to walk alongside each other, even when the path was uncertain. The climax of their journey wasn't some dramatic resolution. It was this, the understanding that healing, true healing, comes when both people are willing to meet each other halfway, when they can acknowledge their flaws and still choose to keep walking forward together. The days that followed that evening in the garden were marked by a quiet but steady shift. The distance between Edward and Dylan, once a chasm that seemed impossible to cross, had narrowed. There were still moments of awkwardness, times when the weight of the past would momentarily resurface, But those moments were fewer now, overshadowed by something more powerful: understanding. Edward no longer carried the same burden of guilt and regret. He had learned, through the slow process of rebuilding his relationship with Dylan, that love didn't always mean having all the answers. It didn't mean fixing things immediately or even perfectly. It meant being present, forgiving, and accepting that both people in a relationship would make mistakes. The only way forward was through mutual respect and an openness to change, even when it felt uncomfortable. Dylan, too, had grown. He had spent so much time focused on his need for independence, on escaping his father's shadow, that he had forgotten the value of connection. Through the slow, sometimes painful process of coming back to his father, he realized that real strength wasn't about going it alone. It was about having the courage to acknowledge where he had gone wrong, to admit his faults, and to take responsibility for the relationships that mattered most to him. One Saturday afternoon, about a month after their heart-to-heart in the garden, Dylan invited Edward to his apartment in the city. It was a modest place, nothing extravagant, but it was his own space, a reflection of a new chapter he had been trying to build. When Edward stepped inside, he was struck by how different Dylan seemed. There was still a rawness to him, but there was also a quiet pride in the way he had put his life together, piece by piece. "I've been thinking a lot," Dylan said as they sat down together, a cup of coffee between them. "I don't know if I can ever fix everything, but I want to start. I want to make things right with you, with myself. I've made mistakes, and I can't change them, but I want to move forward. I want to do better." Edward looked at his son, the young man before him no longer burdened by the anger or resentment that had once defined him. There was sincerity in Dylan's voice, and for the first time, Edward truly believed it. He wasn't asking for forgiveness to wipe the slate clean. He was asking for understanding, for a chance to prove that he could be the person he wanted to be, not just for himself, but for the father who had given him so much. "I've always been proud of you, Dylan," Edward said, his voice filled with quiet emotion. "But it's not about being perfect. It's about showing up. It's about being there for the people who matter and taking responsibility for your choices. You don't have to fix everything today. Just keep moving forward one step at a time. That's all I've ever asked of you." The weight that had once felt so heavy in the pit of Edward's stomach lifted. Dylan didn't need to be someone he wasn't. He didn't need to become a version of himself that Edward had imagined. Dylan needed to be himself, the person he was learning to become. And that, in itself, was enough. As they sat together, sharing stories of the days gone by and the lessons they had learned, Edward realized something important. The past couldn't be changed, but it didn't have to dictate the future. The wounds they had both carried, the misunderstandings and pain, had been part of their journey, but they didn't define it. The true resolution wasn't in erasing the past. It was in how they chose to move forward. Together, Edward didn't need to fix everything, and Dylan didn't need to live up to impossible expectations. They didn't need to make up for lost time, either. What mattered was that they were in this moment, sharing a quiet connection and understanding that healing wasn't linear. It didn't come with a clear beginning and end. It came with patience, with space to grow, and with a willingness to let go of the need to control every outcome. The final message was simple, but it was one that Edward had struggled to learn. Love, in its purest form, isn't about perfection. It's about showing up, being present, and accepting each other's flaws and imperfections. True healing happens not when we have all the answers, but when we choose to be vulnerable with each other and let time do the rest. And so, as father and son sat together, the weight of the past began to fade into the background. They were no longer defined by their past mistakes, but by the strength they had found in learning to forgive, to let go, and to move forward. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, both Edward and Dylan felt ready to face it together. Have you ever faced a moment where you felt completely lost in a relationship, where the distance between you and someone you love seemed insurmountable? Maybe it's with a parent, a child, or someone else close to you. We all go through times when we feel misunderstood, hurt, or disconnected from those we care about the most. But here's the thing, it's never too late to try again. Healing doesn't happen overnight, and it isn't about being perfect. It's about showing up, being honest, and taking responsibility for our actions, even when it's hard. Sometimes, all it takes is one conversation, one step forward to begin rebuilding what's been broken. If you're struggling with a relationship in your life, take a moment to reflect. Is there someone you've pushed away? Someone you've hurt or been hurt by? It might feel daunting to reach out, but trust me, the first step is the hardest. The second step is much easier, and before you know it, you're on a path to healing and reconnection. I challenge you to think about what you can do today to bridge the gap. Whether it's picking up the phone, sending a message, or simply sitting down and having an honest conversation, it all starts with taking that step forward. And if you're ready to share your story, we'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below and let us know how you're navigating healing in your own relationships. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more content on building better relationships and finding strength in vulnerability. You're not alone on this journey. Let's walk through it together. Take the first step. The journey of healing begins with you. Their once close relationship began to fray. Dylan started spending more time with his friends, focusing less on school and more on the fast-paced, materialistic world that seemed to promise instant success. The more Dylan distanced himself, the more Edward clung to the hope that, one day, they would find their way back to each other. But as the years went by, Edward felt the growing distance between them like a weight on his chest. The boy he had raised, the son he had poured his heart into, was slipping away, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Edward was the kind of man who kept his emotions close to his chest. He wasn't one to express his feelings openly or seek comfort from others. His entire life had been a series of quiet sacrifices. He didn't expect gratitude for what he did, but that didn't mean it didn't hurt when he didn't receive it. Dylan, on the other hand, had become increasingly vocal about his dissatisfaction with their life. He talked about how much better things could be if they had more money, a bigger house, or a more luxurious lifestyle. He had grown impatient with the slow pace of life in the small town, frustrated by the limitations that came with living modestly. For Edward, the weight of these comments was crushing. The realization that his son, his own flesh and blood, didn't appreciate the sacrifices he had made for him, stung more than he was willing to admit. And yet, he continued to push forward, always hoping that one day Dylan would come around. But the turning point came when Dylan became an adult. After years of watching him struggle to find his place in the world, Edward thought that perhaps the time had come for his son to find his own way. But he never imagined that the moment would come so abruptly and with such coldness. One night, after a particularly heated argument, Dylan dropped the bombshell. He told Edward that he was tired of living in the shadow of his father's modest lifestyle, tired of being weighed down by his father's expectations. "You're a burden," Dylan said. "My life would be easier if you weren't here." The words struck Edward like a physical blow. He couldn't breathe, couldn't speak, couldn't understand how this was happening. How had things gotten so bad? How had his own son come to see him as a burden instead of the man who had given him everything? Edward couldn't hide the tears that stung his eyes, but he didn't let Dylan see. He couldn't let Dylan see how deeply those words cut. Instead, he did something he had never done before. He walked away. That night, he packed a bag and left the home he had worked so hard to build, the home where he had raised his son, a place filled with memories of all the moments he had sacrificed to make Dylan's life better. He didn't know what the future would hold, but he knew that something had to change. He found a small town, far from the life he had known, and began again. Edward bought a modest house and began to make new friends, something he had never allowed himself to do before. He found work and even started a small business. Slowly, he began to rebuild his life, and in doing so, he discovered something he hadn't realized he had lost: his sense of self-worth. No longer was he living in the shadow of his past mistakes or waiting for validation from others. As the months passed, Edward's new life blossomed. He began to feel more alive than he had in years. He didn't need anyone's approval anymore, least of all his son's. What he had found in that small town was independence, peace, and a newfound respect for himself. But as Edward's life flourished, Dylan's world began to unravel. The very things he had once taken for granted, his job, his relationships, his sense of purpose, all began to slip away. Dylan had believed that his life would be easier without his father, but he soon learned how wrong he had been. And so, in the quiet of Edward's new life, a silent battle was unfolding, one where the truth would soon be revealed and the stakes would be higher than ever. Edward had always believed that family was everything. He'd spent decades building a life for his son, Dylan, one where he sacrificed his time, his comfort, and his own ambitions in order to provide a better future for him. To Edward, the promise of giving his son opportunities was worth every bit of hardship. But now, everything he had worked for seemed to be unraveling in front of him, and the one person he had loved and trusted most was the one who had broken him. The conflict began to surface gradually, like the crack in a dam that grows unnoticed until the entire wall gives way. It started with small jabs, Dylan's dissatisfaction with their home, the occasional complaints about how hard life was in their small town, and how limited his opportunities felt. Edward did his best to push these comments aside, convincing himself that Dylan was just going through a phase. After all, youth is often impatient, and this dissatisfaction was something Edward himself had felt when he was younger. He had been there, dreaming of bigger things, of escaping the small world he was born into. But over time, Dylan's discontentment morphed into something more toxic. Edward had always taken pride in the life he built. Their house might have been modest, but it was a home filled with love and laughter, built by Edward's sweat and sacrifice. Yet Dylan began to see it as a cage, a place that held him back. He had dreams of bigger cities, of moving somewhere that could offer him what he felt was his due: luxury, status, success. Dylan wanted more, and in his mind, his father's life was nothing but a reminder of the life he didn't want. Edward could feel the distance growing between them, as though an invisible wall was being built with every word Dylan spoke. For Edward, the disillusionment was a quiet storm. He worked harder, tried to offer Dylan more, convinced that love could bridge the gap. He poured himself into his work even more, hoping his efforts would somehow show Dylan how much he cared, how much he was willing to sacrifice. But Dylan didn't seem to see the sacrifices anymore. He only saw the things they didn't have, the things they couldn't afford. Then, one evening, everything came to a head. It was a rainy night, the kind of night that made the house feel even smaller, more closed off. Edward had just returned from a long day's work, his clothes damp from the storm, his back aching from lifting heavy boxes. He didn't expect much more than a warm meal and a quiet evening. What he didn't expect was the coldness that met him when he walked through the door. Dylan was sitting at the kitchen table, his phone in his hand, his eyes focused on the screen. He didn't look up when Edward entered. The air in the room was thick, but not with comfort. It was tense, as though something unsaid hung in the space between them. Edward didn't know what had happened, but he could feel that something was off. "Dylan, we need to talk," Edward said, his voice trying to mask the concern he felt. Dylan's eyes didn't meet his. Instead, he sighed, as if frustrated by the very act of having to engage in conversation. "What is it now, Dad?" he asked, his tone sharp. "I'm busy." Edward's heart sank. He had never heard Dylan speak to him this way before. "We're family, Dylan," he said softly, trying to hold on to the hope that there was still some connection between them. "We should be able to talk to each other." Dylan put down his phone with an exasperated sigh. "I don't need you to keep telling me what I should be doing," he snapped. "I know what I want in life, and I know that I can't get it here. This place is suffocating me. Everything about this life feels small. You don't get it, Dad. You never will." Edward stood frozen, trying to digest the words. His son, the boy he had raised, the one he had done everything for, was telling him that the life Edward had worked so hard to build was nothing but a burden. The hurt was sharp and sudden, like a knife slicing through years of love and sacrifice. But the pain wasn't just in Dylan's words. It was in the indifference behind them. Dylan's anger wasn't even directed at the circumstances. It was directed at Edward. "I'm tired, Dad," Dylan continued, his voice dripping with bitterness. "Tired of living in your shadow. Tired of being part of your boring life. You're holding me back. If it weren't for you, I could be out there doing something real." Edward's heart pounded in his chest as the realization hit him. Dylan didn't just want more. He wanted out. Out of their home, out of this life, out of the family that had given him everything. But it wasn't just about material things or ambition. Dylan wanted independence from the very foundation of his life, the love and care Edward had given him. That foundation had become a prison in his eyes, and Edward was the warden. Tears welled up in Edward's eyes, though he fought them back. "I did everything for you, Dylan. Everything. And this is how you repay me." Dylan stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I don't need your charity," he spat, his voice laced with anger. "I don't need you trying to control my life. Maybe if you weren't so stuck in your ways, you'd understand that I'm not you. I'm better than this." The words hit Edward like a punch to the gut. "Better than this?" he repeated, his voice trembling. "You think you're better than me?" Dylan didn't answer. Instead, he turned away, heading toward the door. "I'm done, Dad. I can't keep living this way. I don't care anymore." And with that, Dylan walked out of the house, leaving Edward standing there, speechless and broken. The silence in the house was deafening. Edward stood frozen, his mind racing, his heart breaking. He had given everything for this family, every ounce of his strength, every dream he had ever had for himself. All of it was poured into Dylan's future. And yet, here he was, standing in the aftermath of that love, alone and rejected. That night, for the first time in years, Edward faced a choice. He could continue to live for Dylan, begging for a fraction of the love and respect he had so freely given. Or he could finally walk away, find himself again, build a life where he was valued, where he wasn't just a burden. The conflict had been set. It wasn't just a battle between father and son anymore. It was a battle between Edward's past and future, between the love he had always given and the respect he now had to earn from himself. And as the days passed, the realization became clear. The only way forward was to break free. But doing so would mean letting go of everything he had ever known. Edward's life, as he had known it, was slipping through his fingers. The words his son had thrown at him still echoed in his mind. "You're a burden," Dylan had said. The weight of those words crushed him, like a vice tightening around his chest. He couldn't understand how it had come to this. How had his life, the one he had worked so hard to build, become so meaningless in his son's eyes? After that night, everything felt different. The house, once filled with laughter and warmth, now seemed cold and hollow. The rooms that had witnessed years of family dinners, birthdays, and quiet moments of comfort now felt like empty shells. Edward walked through the halls in a daze, his every step a reminder of what he had lost. Dylan had gone, leaving only a broken heart and the remnants of what had once been a father-son bond. Edward had always been the strong one. He had built his life with his own hands, never asking for help, never seeking sympathy. But this was something he wasn't prepared for. This wasn't the kind of pain he could fix with hard work or determination. There was no amount of sacrifice he could offer to heal the wound Dylan had inflicted. This pain cut deeper than anything Edward had ever known. The next few days passed in a blur. Edward continued to go to work, as if nothing had changed, but inside, everything was crumbling. He found himself withdrawing into himself, keeping to the quiet solitude of his small house. His mind constantly replayed the argument with Dylan, searching for answers, wondering where he had gone wrong. Was he really a burden? Was it his fault that Dylan had turned against him? Had he been too strict, too focused on providing for the family at the expense of their relationship? The more Edward thought about it, the more the guilt ate away at him. He had never wanted to be a burden. All he had ever wanted was to give Dylan the world, to ensure that his son had every opportunity he had never had. He had sacrificed his own happiness for that. And now, it seemed like it had all been for nothing. His son had rejected him, and with that rejection, Edward's sense of purpose seemed to vanish. But then something unexpected happened. A few weeks after Dylan had walked out, Edward received a message, a text of all things. It was from Dylan. "Dad, I need to talk to you." Edward stared at the screen for a long time. His heart raced. Was this the moment he had been waiting for? Was Dylan finally going to apologize? Was he going to admit that he had been wrong? Edward didn't know, but he knew one thing for sure. He had to face this, face the boy he had raised, faced the pain that had been eating away at him since that night. Edward agreed to meet. He suggested a local coffee shop, a neutral place where they could talk without the weight of home hanging over them. When the day arrived, Edward arrived early, his heart in his throat. He had no idea what to expect. Was Dylan going to apologize? Or would this be another moment of rejection? Edward couldn't prepare for either outcome. When Dylan walked in, Edward's breath caught in his chest. His son looked different. Older, more worn out, his shoulders slumped, as though the weight of the world had been placed on him. Dylan looked around the coffee shop, avoiding Edward's gaze for a moment before finally sitting down across from him. The silence between them was thick, heavy with unspoken words. "Hey," Dylan said quietly, breaking the silence. I just wanted to say I'm sorry for what I said that night." His voice was soft, hesitant, as though the words were hard for him to get out. "I didn't mean it. I don't know what's been going on with me. I've been really messed up lately." Edward looked at his son, searching his face for any sign of sincerity. The boy who had once been so full of life, the boy who had once looked up to him, was now a shadow of the person he had been. His apology didn't bring the comfort Edward had expected, nor did it erase the pain. It was a start, but it wasn't enough. "Not yet. I don't know what's going on with me either," Dylan continued, his hands fidgeting nervously on the table. "I've just been trying so hard to figure out who I am, you know? And I guess I thought I had to do it on my own. I didn't know how to deal with everything, with you and Mom, with the life I have here." Edward listened, his heart aching as he watched Dylan struggle to put his feelings into words. It was clear now that Dylan wasn't the same person he had been before. Something had shifted within him, something that Edward couldn't fix with his own actions. This wasn't about his work or his sacrifices. This was about Dylan finding his own path, his own identity, and it wasn't a path that included Edward. "I've been selfish," Dylan admitted, his voice breaking. "I took everything you did for me for granted. I never saw it. Not really. I just wanted to escape. I thought leaving everything behind would fix my problems. But I don't think it will. I'm just lost, Dad. I don't know what to do anymore." Edward's chest tightened as he heard the words he had been dreading. Dylan was lost, and there was nothing Edward could do to guide him back. This was something Dylan had to figure out for himself. Edward had tried to give him everything, but now he realized he had to let Dylan go. The pain of the realization hit him hard, but there was something else too: relief. A small, quiet part of him knew that Dylan's journey was his own, and as much as Edward wanted to protect him, he couldn't control it. The father in him wanted to reach out to reassure Dylan that everything would be okay, that he was there for him no matter what. But the man he had become knew better. This wasn't about fixing things anymore. It was about letting go. Dylan looked up at him, his eyes full of regret, but Edward couldn't offer the comfort Dylan so desperately wanted. Instead, he gave him a simple truth. "You have to find your way, Dylan. I've always been here for you, but you're the one who has to figure out who you are. I can't do that for you anymore." The words stung, but they were necessary. For both of them. In that moment, the conflict deepened even further. Edward had done everything he could to shape Dylan's future, but now it was time for Dylan to shape his own. And though it tore Edward's heart apart, he knew that the only way forward was through letting go. Edward walked away from that coffee shop with a sense of finality, but also a profound weight in his chest. He hadn't expected everything to be resolved in a single conversation, but the reality of what he'd just experienced settled in as he sat in his car, staring blankly at the steering wheel. Dylan's words, though an apology, had not given him the peace he had longed for. The truth was, there was no easy fix for what had happened between them. Their relationship, once full of promise and love, was now fractured in ways Edward didn't know how to repair. Over the next few weeks, the emotional toll continued to take its toll on Edward. He found himself questioning everything: his past decisions, his choices, his sacrifices. He had poured his entire being into providing for Dylan, shaping his life in ways he thought would give him the best chance at success. But the realization that his son had grown resentful of him, that all those years of hard work had been viewed as a hindrance, was unbearable. It wasn't just about the material things anymore. It was about the emotional toll of believing he had failed as a father. Edward tried to distract himself with work, keeping busy with projects around the house, and even starting a small side business that he had put on hold for years. But despite his efforts, he couldn't escape the gnawing emptiness. At night, when the house was quiet, and the only sound was the soft hum of the refrigerator, he would lie awake, replaying every moment he had spent with Dylan. He thought of the early days, teaching him how to ride a bike, the father-son trips they took together, the way Dylan would look at him with wide eyes, trusting that his father knew the way. How had it all gone so wrong? The sting of betrayal became even more intense when Edward learned that Dylan had moved to the city. He had left the small town they had called home, the place where he had grown up, without a word of goodbye. Edward's heart sank as he heard the news from a mutual acquaintance. The finality of it hit him hard. Dylan had walked away, and in doing so, he had closed the door on the family he had once been a part of. The distance between them wasn't just physical, it was emotional, and it felt like there was no way back. Weeks turned into months, and though Dylan reached out occasionally, their conversations were shallow and fleeting. There were no heartfelt apologies, no deep discussions about the past, no attempts to heal the wounds. Instead, Dylan sent brief text messages or occasional phone calls, speaking in a detached, almost indifferent manner. Edward could tell that his son was struggling, but the barriers that had been erected between them seemed insurmountable. The walls that Dylan had built, brick by brick, were now so high that Edward couldn't see over them. The emotional distance became unbearable for Edward. He found himself constantly battling his own feelings of inadequacy, anger, and sadness. How could he fix this? How could he bridge the gap between them? There were moments when he thought about reaching out, trying again to explain his side, to tell Dylan how much he loved him, but something stopped him. Maybe it was fear that his words would fall on deaf ears, or worse, that his son might reject him even more harshly than before. But it wasn't just the fear of rejection that paralyzed him. It was the deeper question of what he had to offer anymore. The years of sacrifice, the sleepless nights, the endless hours of hard work. Was it all for nothing? Was he just a stepping stone in Dylan's life? Something to be discarded when it no longer served a purpose? Edward couldn't find an answer. It was a question that haunted him every day, gnawing at him in ways he didn't know how to address. It wasn't until one particularly lonely night, when Edward sat staring at old family photos, that he began to understand the deeper nature of the conflict. He had always viewed his relationship with Dylan through the lens of duty. He was the provider, the protector, the one who made sure his son had everything he needed. But in doing so, he had unknowingly created a dynamic that had placed an immense burden on Dylan. Dylan had never asked for all that Edward had given him. He had never asked to be burdened with the expectations that came with being Edward's son. In his efforts to provide for Dylan, Edward had unintentionally stifled his son's sense of independence. Dylan had been suffocated by the weight of his father's sacrifices, unable to forge his own path or identity because he was constantly under the shadow of what Edward had built. Dylan's resentment wasn't just about material wealth or career goals. It was about a need to break free, to find himself outside of the life Edward had shaped for him. And in trying to protect him, in trying to create the perfect life for Dylan, Edward had inadvertently trapped him in a life that was never truly his. This realization didn't bring relief, though. It only deepened the conflict, as Edward realized how far removed he had become from understanding his son's needs. The emotional stakes had risen because now Edward had to face the painful truth. He had been so focused on giving Dylan a life he thought was best that he had overlooked the emotional space his son needed to grow. This wasn't about money or status or anything external. It was about freedom. Dylan had felt suffocated, and now he was paying the price for it in ways that Edward couldn't fix. But despite all this, there was still love in Edward's heart. Love for the son he had tried to raise, love for the boy who had once looked up to him, and even love for the man who Dylan was becoming. It was that love that kept Edward moving forward, even when every step felt like it was taking him further from his son. He knew that this wasn't a battle he could win by force or by trying to control Dylan's life anymore. The emotional stakes had shifted once again. It wasn't about saving his relationship with Dylan. It was about accepting that their paths had diverged and learning to love his son in a way that allowed him to find his own way. It was a painful, humbling realization, but it was also one of the most important lessons Edward had ever learned. In the end, the conflict was no longer just between father and son. It was a battle between Edward's love and his need to control, between the past he had built for Dylan and the future his son needed to create for himself. The emotional stakes were higher than ever, but so was the understanding that love, in its truest form, often means letting go. Edward had been living in a constant state of internal conflict for months. Each day felt like a weight he carried, the burden of his son's rejection pressing down on him harder than anything he had ever faced. The silence between them stretched, and though Dylan had reached out occasionally, the distance between them seemed impossible to bridge. The regret, the sorrow, and the frustration seemed endless. He had spent so much of his life trying to create a perfect future for Dylan, but now it felt like everything he had worked for had led him to this point. Alone and rejected, questioning his every decision. Then, one evening, the phone rang. It was late, too late for anything good to come from it, but when Edward saw Dylan's name on the caller ID, his heart skipped a beat. He had been waiting for this moment, the moment when his son might finally reach out, but the tension still gripped him. He wasn't sure he was ready, but he knew he had to answer. "Hello." Edward's voice was cautious, tinged with a mix of hope and fear. "Dad, it's me." Dylan's voice came through, low and unsure. There was an edge to it, an unfamiliar tremble that caught Edward's attention immediately. "Dylan, where are you? What's going on?" Edward's concern bubbled up despite himself. Dylan's voice was raw, not the usual detachment Edward had come to expect. I don't know what to do anymore, Dad. I need to talk to you. I messed up. I'm not sure where I'm going, but I feel so lost," Dylan said, his words stumbling out, each one heavier than the last. Edward felt a jolt in his chest. This wasn't what he had expected. For so long, he had been waiting for this moment, but not like this, raw, vulnerable, broken. Dylan had always prided himself on being independent, on having control over his life. To hear him admit that he was lost, that he was struggling, shook Edward to his core. "Are you okay?" Edward asked, his voice softer now, the protective instinct of a father taking over. "What happened, Dylan? Where are you?" "I don't know, Dad," Dylan said, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought I had everything figured out. I thought leaving, running away, was the answer. But it's not. I don't even recognize myself anymore. I thought I could be someone else. But now I just feel empty." Edward sat still for a moment, the silence between them hanging heavy. He hadn't expected this, hadn't expected Dylan to admit that he was struggling. His son, the one who had rejected everything Edward had worked for, now seemed to be in the midst of his own turmoil. And for the first time, Edward realized something profound. This wasn't about him anymore. This wasn't just about the father who had given everything and felt betrayed. This was about Dylan's journey. Dylan was lost, but not because of Edward's mistakes. Dylan was lost because he had never been allowed to find himself on his own terms. "Dylan," Edward said slowly, his voice full of quiet understanding. "I think I've been trying to fix things for you. I've been trying to make everything right, to give you everything you need. But maybe I've been holding on too tight, trying to protect you from things I couldn't protect you from. I've realized that maybe the best thing I could do now is let you find your own way." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Edward could hear Dylan's breath catch in his throat, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a shift, a sense of clarity that had eluded him for months. Dylan was finally hearing him, really hearing him. This wasn't about proving who was right or wrong anymore. This was about a father letting go, about giving his son the space to become the person he was meant to be. "I'm sorry, Dad," Dylan whispered. "I've been so angry, so confused. I didn't see how much you've sacrificed for me. I thought I had to get away to find myself, but now I see maybe I was just running from the truth. The truth is, I've been trying to escape who I am, who I was, and in doing that, I lost sight of the person who helped me become who I am. You." Edward's chest tightened, a flood of emotions overwhelming him. Dylan had never spoken to him like this. For so long, Edward had felt like a failure, a man who had tried so hard and had failed in the one area that mattered most. But now, hearing his son's voice, hearing the regret and the realization in Dylan's words, Edward understood that the road to healing wasn't just about fixing what was broken. It was about letting go of the need to control it. I've been trying so hard to be everything you needed, Dylan. But I didn't realize that by doing that, I wasn't giving you the space to become your own person. I thought I could fix it all, but I can't. All I can do now is be here for you, no matter what. Dylan sniffed. I don't know what to do, Dad. I've made so many mistakes, I don't know if I can fix it. Edward's voice was steady, filled with a quiet strength. You don't have to fix everything, Dylan. Life doesn't work like that. What matters now is what you do next. You can't undo the past, but you can shape the future. I'm not here to judge you or tell you how to live. I'm just here to listen and support you however I can. In that moment, something in Dylan's voice shifted. The bitterness, the anger, the rejection, it all seemed to meld away, replaced by a quiet acceptance. For the first time in a long while, there was no animosity in the air. There was no burden. There was only the possibility of something new. Edward realized that the turning point wasn't just about Dylan coming to terms with his past. It was about Edward coming to terms with his role in it and finding the strength to let go. I don't know if I deserve this, Dad, Dylan said quietly, but I want to try to make things right. I want to work on this. Edward had been living in a constant state of internal conflict for months. Each day felt like a weight he carried, the burden of his son's rejection pressing down on him harder than anything he had ever faced. The silence between them stretched, and though Dylan had reached out occasionally, the distance between them seemed impossible to bridge. The regret, the sorrow, and the frustration seemed endless. He had spent so much of his life trying to create a perfect future for Dylan, but now it felt like everything he had worked for had led him to this point. Alone and rejected, questioning his every decision. Then, one evening, the phone rang. It was late, too late for anything good to come from it, but when Edward saw Dylan's name on the caller ID, his heart skipped a beat. He had been waiting for this moment, the moment when his son might finally reach out, but the tension still gripped him. He wasn't sure he was ready, but he knew he had to answer. Hello. Edward's voice was cautious, tinged with a mix of hope and fear. Dad, it's me. Dylan's voice came through, low and unsure. There was an edge to it, an unfamiliar tremble that caught Edward's attention immediately. Dylan, where are you? What's going on? Edward's concern bubbled up despite himself. Dylan's voice was raw, not the usual detachment Edward had come to expect. I don't know what to do anymore, Dad. I need to talk to you. I messed up. I'm not sure where I'm going, but I feel so lost, Dylan said, his words stumbling out, each one heavier than the last. Edward felt a jolt in his chest. This wasn't what he had expected. For so long, he had been waiting for this moment, but not like this, raw, vulnerable, broken. Dylan had always prided himself on being independent, on having control over his life. To hear him admit that he was lost, that he was struggling, shook Edward to his core. Are you okay? Edward asked, his voice softer now, the protective instinct of a father taking over. What happened, Dylan? Where are you? I don't know, Dad, Dylan said, his voice thick with emotion. I thought I had everything figured out. I thought leaving, running away, was the answer. But it's not. I don't even recognize myself anymore. I thought I could be someone else. But now I just feel empty. Edward sat still for a moment, the silence between them hanging heavy. He hadn't expected this, hadn't expected Dylan to admit that he was struggling. His son, the one who had rejected everything Edward had worked for, now seemed to be in the midst of his own turmoil. And for the first time, Edward realized something profound. This wasn't about him anymore. This wasn't just about the father who had given everything and felt betrayed. This was about Dylan's journey. Dylan was lost, but not because of Edward's mistakes. Dylan was lost because he had never been allowed to find himself on his own terms. Dylan, Edward said slowly, his voice full of quiet understanding. I think I've been trying to fix things for you. I've been trying to make everything right, to give you everything you need. But maybe I've been holding on too tight, trying to protect you from things I couldn't protect you from. I've realized that maybe the best thing I could do now is let you find your own way. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Edward could hear Dylan's breath catch in his throat, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a shift, a sense of clarity that had eluded him for months. Dylan was finally hearing him, really hearing him. This wasn't about proving who was right or wrong anymore. This was about a father letting go, about giving his son the space to become the person he was meant to be. "I'm sorry, Dad," Dylan whispered. "I've been so angry, so confused. I didn't see how much you've sacrificed for me. I thought I had to get away to find myself, but now I see maybe I was just running from the truth. The truth is, I've been trying to escape who I am, who I was, and in doing that, I lost sight of the person who helped me become who I am. You." Edward's chest tightened, a flood of emotions overwhelming him. Dylan had never spoken to him like this. For so long, Edward had felt like a failure, a man who had tried so hard and had failed in the one area that mattered most. But now, hearing his son's voice, hearing the regret and the realization in Dylan's words, Edward understood that the road to healing wasn't just about fixing what was broken. It was about letting go of the need to control it. "I've been trying so hard to be everything you needed, Dylan. But I didn't realize that by doing that, I wasn't giving you the space to become your own person. I thought I could fix it all, but I can't. All I can do now is be here for you, no matter what." Dylan sniffed. "I don't know what to do, Dad. I've made so many mistakes, I don't know if I can fix it." Edward's voice was steady, filled with a quiet strength. "You don't have to fix everything, Dylan. Life doesn't work like that. What matters now is what you do next. You can't undo the past, but you can shape the future. I'm not here to judge you or tell you how to live. I'm just here to listen and support you however I can." In that moment, something in Dylan's voice shifted. The bitterness, the anger, the rejection, it all seemed to meld away, replaced by a quiet acceptance. For the first time in a long while, there was no animosity in the air. There was no burden. There was only the possibility of something new. Edward realized that the turning point wasn't just about Dylan coming to terms with his past. It was about Edward coming to terms with his role in it and finding the strength to let go. "I don't know if I deserve this, Dad," Dylan said quietly, "but I want to try to make things right. I want to work on this." Edward stepped back after a long moment, still holding his son by the shoulders. "You don't have to have all the answers, Dylan. You never have. I've made mistakes too, and I'm not expecting perfection from you. We're both learning. But I want you to know that I'm proud of you for showing up, for wanting to make things right." Dylan nodded, wiping his eyes, a look of relief crossing his face. "I'm going to try, Dad. I don't have all the answers, but I want to make it right. I want to rebuild this." As father and son stood there, the years of bitterness and pain slowly began to dissolve. The journey wasn't over. There was still a long road ahead, but for the first time in a long time, Edward felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. He didn't know what the future would bring, but he knew that this was a turning point. Dylan was no longer the lost son he had feared he had lost forever. He was a son who had found his way back, one step at a time. And that, Edward realized, was enough for now. They spent time together in quiet, simple ways. Dylan came over to visit occasionally, helping Edward with odd jobs around the house, tasks that used to seem mundane but now held a deeper meaning. They talked, not about grand philosophical ideas or deep life-changing moments, but about small things: how Edward's garden was coming along, how Dylan had been handling his new job in the city, or how the weather had been particularly unpredictable that week. These conversations were small, insignificant to the outside world, but to them, they meant everything. They were rebuilding the foundation of their relationship, brick by brick. One afternoon, as they worked side by side in the yard, Edward caught a glimpse of Dylan, his hands in the dirt, his face focused but relaxed. There was no tension in his posture anymore, no bitterness in his eyes. For the first time in a long time, Edward saw the son he had known before everything had gone wrong, the boy who had looked up to him, who had trusted him without question. "Remember when you were little," Edward said as he raked leaves, "and you'd follow me around asking if you could help with everything?" Dylan chuckled softly, glancing up. "Yeah, you'd always say, 'Go on, get out of here, I'll handle it.'" He paused, wiping his hands on his pants. "I think I used to think I could fix things just by being around. But maybe it wasn't about that. Maybe it was just about being present like you are now. Edward paused mid-swipe, surprised by the weight of Dylan's words. He turned to face his son, locking eyes for a moment. Maybe you're right. Sometimes just being there is enough. I guess I didn't always see that. I thought I had to fix everything, make everything perfect, and I didn't realize that you were already learning how to stand on your own. You didn't need me to fix things for you. Dylan nodded, his expression softening. I know now. I didn't get that at the time. I kept pushing you away, thinking I had to do it all on my own, but I was wrong. Edward felt a lump form in his throat. This wasn't the angry, resentful young man who had stormed out months ago. This was a son who was beginning to see the complexity of what had transpired between them. It was a moment of clarity, one that Edward had longed for, but never truly believed would come. Dad, Dylan's voice broke through Edward's thoughts. He turned to look at him. I don't know if I ever said this, but I'm proud of you. For everything you've done. For sticking with me, even when I made it hard. I know I messed up. I just hope one day you'll know that I appreciate everything. Edward's heart swelled. There in those simple words, Dylan had given him something he hadn't realized he needed. A moment of validation, a recognition of all the sacrifices he had made without ever expecting anything in return. It wasn't about grand gestures or sweeping apologies. It was about Dylan finally seeing, truly seeing, what his father had done for him and understanding the love behind all of it. I'm proud of you too, son, Edward said, his voice thick with emotion. I don't need perfection from you. I just need you to be happy, to be your own person. And you're getting there. I can see it. For a moment, neither of them said anything. They simply stood there, side by side, watching the last light of day fade away, the evening settling quietly around them. They weren't fixed yet, and perhaps they never would be. But they had taken a step forward, together.